over the past year, I've done a Reddit reply almost every single Friday. And it's a fun way to talk to the community about different topics, about different things going on. And while this isn't a Reddit reply video, one of the things that does come up in these videos a lot are rules questions. Rules questions are one of those things that a lot of people in Marvel Champions have generally questions about, obviously. And in the 1.5 rule book, it's 56 pages long. There's a lot of stuff to cover. And that doesn't even include the other rule book that comes with the game. So there's a lot to go through things. So I wanted to create a list of 10 common rules mistakes that I see, or 10 common issues that I see come up, and maybe this video will help you out, right? And if you still have more questions, put it down in the comments, right? Put it down in the comments. We'll be more than happy to answer them down there. And if there's enough of them down there, I'll just do like a part two, I guess, or something like that. That's not a problem. But anyway, I just wanted to do a video just to kind of address a lot of these common rules mistakes, because there are a bunch of them, or just like things people need clarification on, right? Because like I said, there's a lot of rules to go through, and people don't always do it, which I get, because you just want to play the game, so I understand. So we're going to go through 10 of them. The first two are a little bit different than the rest of them, and I'll explain as we get to it. But the very first one has to do with timing. All right, so this is the 1.5 rules book. This is on page 5 of the rules reference book. Like I said, 1.5. You can find this online. Timing is one of the new things they kind of like really updated and really talked about. And I think it's really important because some abilities have timing priority over other abilities. In order, the time priority abilities with the same triggering condition is constant abilities with keywords and the bad icons, then status cards such as your stun, you're confused, because you're tough as well. Force interrupt abilities, your boost when defeated, when revealed abilities, then your force response, then your response, then your consequential damage. And we'll go over interrupts and responses later on. But I think this timing thing helps out a lot of people, because a lot of people aren't always sure when a card triggers or like doesn't trigger or whatever else. This will give you a very rough idea, right? This is a very rough idea of when those things would trigger. And I think if you just kind of either memorize this chart or just, memorize this page 5, this is really good. There's one other thing that I think is really important. Again, it's not necessarily a rules thing, but initiating abilities is the next thing we're going to go over. And if you understand this section, I think a lot of questions are going to be solved for you. All right, so now we're going over this is number 2, initiating abilities. This is on page, what is that, 20? Page 20 of the rules reference page. It starts in the right hand column here, kind of behind my head. So when it says is when a player wishes to play a card or initiate a triggered ability, that player first declares their intent. Then the player checks the following condition in order. Check play restrictions. Can the card be played or the ability initiated at this time? If the card or ability specifies one or more targets, check that it has at least one valid target. If that card or ability does not have at least one valid target, it cannot be played or initiated. Determine the cost or costs to play the card or initiate the ability, taking any modifiers into account. Cool. So then, if those two things have been established, then you can do the following things, which is apply any modifiers to the cost, pay the cost, mark or make all choose decisions required. Then the card commences being played, or the effects of the ability attempt to initiate. The card is played, or the ability, if not canceled in step 6, resolves. The card enters play, or if it is an event card, its effects resolve and it is placed in the owner's discard pile. If any of the steps above or if any of the above steps would make the triggering condition of an interrupt ability true, right? And we talked a little about interrupts and whatnot with timing. That ability may be initiated just before that triggering condition becomes true. Okay. If any of the above steps would make the triggering condition of a responsibility true, that ability may be initiated immediately after that triggering condition becomes true, right? So again, interrupt first. What's the second one? Response second. If the ability being initiated is on a card that is in play, the sequence does not stop from completing if that card leaves play during this sequence, unless that card leaving play prevents a required cost from being played. It's a very nuanced thing, but in general, like you play a card, even if it gets like knocked out, whatever, like it still would go through its thing. So I know this seems like very broad and very weird, but if you understand, I feel like that sequence of things, and just go through that sequence of like, can I play this card, right? And go through those steps and outline those steps. It'll help solve some things, right? Can I do XYZ thing, especially with playing cards, right? That's a big question, is just playing cards. If you go through that sequence and go through all that, I think it will answer a lot of your questions. All right, this next one is a big one, and this is defend and defense. Now, defend and defense got updated in the 1.4 rulings. It made defending a lot bigger and more important of a thing. And there's a lot here. There's a lot under defend defense. Like, so for example, it starts on page, what is this, 13 of the rules reference, and it starts on the left-hand column midway through and goes all the way through. So we're not going to go through all of the, no, I guess we could go through all this, but it's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot going on here. So only one player at a time can defend against an enemy attack. While a player is defending, no other player can defend against the same attack. Right, so if you're playing multiplayer, you can't team up on the defense. Pretty simple. A hero can use their basic defense power to defend against enemy attack. A hero must exhaust to use this power. The amount of damage dealt by the attack is reduced by the hero's defense value, and any remaining damage is dealt to that hero. While a hero is defending against an attack, no other friendly character can defend against attack. Kind of reiterating what it's saying before. The big thing with understanding about this is that you have to use, or I'm sorry, you must exhaust to use your basic defense power, and then the modifier applies. So I've seen people ask, like, if you play desperate defense, right? So let's just desperate defense. Let's just see that being brought up really fast. If you play desperate defense where it has like +2 stat line, but you didn't exhaust to defend, would you get that +2 defense? Well, no, because you must exhaust to do that, right? That's just how that would work. So when your hero defends against an attack, it gets +2 for that defense. We'll get into more convoluted defense stuff possibly later, but just people have asked, there's ways to trigger this without actually exhausting. Do you get the +2 defense? You would, but you're not defending, so thus you haven't exhausted, so thus you don't get to actually use your basic defense. The amount of damage dealt by the attack is reduced, all that fun stuff. Okay. When a card ability says to declare a hero the defender of an attack, that hero is considered to be making a basic defense. Okay. An ally can exhaust the defending against enemy attack. Damage from that attack is dealt to that ally. While an ally is defending against an attack, no other friendly character could defend against the attack, right? So if your ally defends, you can't like pop it in, like try to step in as well. When a card ability says to declare an ally the defender of the attack, that ally becomes the defender of the attack. Okay, cool. When a player initiates triggered ability label as such as defense, such as hero interrupt during an enemy attack, that a player's identity becomes a defender and is considered to have defended the attack if there is not already a defender. So this is a big one, right? This is kind of one of the bigger ones, and it kind of goes into more of these steps down here. The player's identity is considered to be defender as much as defense label and all that fun stuff. Okay, so why is this important? So I need to actually find the card for a second, but this was one of the big changes in the 1.4 ruling that kind of honestly kind of changed a lot of things for people. So let's take, for example, where is Ghost Spider? So Ghost Spider had something like Jump Flip. Okay, so Jump Flip says when you would take any amount of damage, prevent 2 of that damage. If you pay for this card using energy resource, remove up to 2 threat from the main scheme. Now, why is this important? Well, this has the defense word on it and interrupt hero interrupt defense, right? So even if you never exhausted, technically there is no defender for the attack. You're about to get hit with damage, let's say 2 damage, and you play this card Jump Flip, right? Play it, and you are now defending that attack, right? Even though you didn't exhaust to defend, you played this card to defend, right? This is kind of huge to note, and we'll get back to desperate defense in 1 second. So a lot of people have questions about this. When do you become the defender? Do you have to exhaust to defend? Not always. If you play a card like this, the condition is when you would take any amount of damage, then you can play this card, prevent 2 of that damage. And because it's a defense card, you are now defending. This is important with desperate defense because what people have asked about is that, well, this is the defense card. Does this work? And it says, well, if you read the actual text, when your hero defends against an attack, so we first have to defend against the attack, it gets +2 for that attack. If you take no damage from that attack, ready your hero. Now, let's take this a step further, right? We're going to get really into this for a second. If you were to play Jump Flip, right? Let's say you were already exhausted for some reason. I don't know. You defended against something else and you're getting hit by a minion now, right? You defended against a villain, but you're going to get hit from the minion. The minion's attacking you for 2. You play Jump Flip, right? So the minion's going to hit you for 2, but when you would take any amount of damage, prevent 2 of that damage. You are now defending. So When your hero defends against an attack on Desperate Defense, because you are defending now, it gets +2 defense for that attack, which means nothing. Don't worry about that. But if you took no damage from that attack, you can ready your hero. It's kind of confusing, right? It's kind of confusing, but it's important to learn this, right? It's really important to learn this because stuff like this will really help you out and kind of understand it. Now, does that situation at all like ever happen? No, I've never played the game that way, and it probably never will happen for me. But it's just important to know when you are defending. I'll bring up one more thing why it's important with Jump Flip to understand. Okay, Jump Flip, when you would take any damage, you're now defending, is a card like Unflappable, right? So after you defend against an attack and take no damage, exhaust Unflappable and draw a card. Again, even if you don't exhaust, it's okay, because if you play Jump Flip to now become defender and defending, you can then trigger Unflappable if you took no damage, right? So after you defend against an attack, well, even if I didn't exhaust, I jump flipped, which counts as a defense card, which means I'm now defending. You would, and you take no damage from the attack. You get to exhaust. You get to exhaust Unflappable, and you get to draw one card. I get it. It's very, very weird and complicated, and for the most part, you don't have to worry about it too much. Right? This is more realistic of something that you would see come up that kind of affects your game. But that's one of the main rules things that they're talking about here, and kind of this, and this whole section of it. Yeah. So again, abilities that trigger when your hero defends against an attack can be triggered when resolving a defense labeled ability. Right? That's like specifying it very, very obviously for it. So again, read through kind of this section. They talk about when it can be played and all that fun stuff and whatnot. But all this stuff is really important to know. The other thing, and we'll get into more of this, is any triggered effects that resolved before the defending player was declared. I'm sorry. Any triggered effects that resolved before the defending player was declared that refer to you, right? And we'll get into you later, still refer to the player who was attacked originally. Any constant or boost abilities that refer to you refer to the defending player. That's a whole thing. We'll get into that later. But anyway, this is the main defense section. I know it's kind of complicated, but that's one of the big things to learn, is that even if you don't exhaust and you use a defense card, you are now defending. All right, number 4 is Cost Arrow. This gets asked a lot because a lot of people get confused. Do I have to resolve everything before the arrow? Absolutely. So this is page 12 of the rulebook. A Cost Arrow icon in ability text distinguishes a cost from an effect in a pay cost arrow resolve effect format. Non-bullet text before the arrow must be paid and or resolved in full before the text after the arrow icon can be resolved. So let's take our Unflappable example once again. So after you defend against an attack and take no damage, let's say you do that, but you can't exhaust Unflappable because it's already exhausted or something like that. Well, then you can't draw a card, right? That's very simple what it means. You must be able to do all the things before it. Now, I'm not going to get so much into this ruling because this ruling is still really hard, but there is the deal and take ruling. And we'll try to quickly bring it up when I talk about it. But this was a ruling they brought in later. It's in the 1.5 rules, kind of, but it's not really my favorite explained rule. So we're not going to even look at it because I personally think it's more confusing than it really needs to be. So let me just really fast. Here we go. So the deal and take ruling basically came around because of this card, right? So Steel Fist says deal 5 damage to an enemy. You may discard a tough status from your hero, arrow, stun and confuse the enemy. Now the reason this is important is because according to the cost arrow ruling, all of everything beforehand must be resolved in full before the text of the arrow can be resolved, right? So the issue that arose from this originally was that, well, let's say you have an enemy with only 4 life, right? So can I play this card, right? Because I can't deal 5 damage because they only have 4 life. I'm not able to deal the full 5 damage. So then I can't do the rest of the card where it says you discard a tough status from your card and then stun and confuse the enemy. Like, why can't I do this? So they basically invented a new rule of the difference between deal and take. And we're not going to get into super nuanced stuff, but basically anything that says deal, you don't have to deal the full amount, but you must take the full amount. And we're kind of combining this because this is the time, like, when you see deal and take, it's usually with the cost arrow that's most important. But anyway, if a card says deal X amount of damage, you can deal up to X amount of damage. You don't have to do it. But if a card says take damage, you must take all that damage for that card to work and to actually be effective. Another quick example of this that a lot of people ask about is actually has to do with Wolverine. and he does something with take. So for example, his claws say exhaust Wolverine's claws, choose an attack event in your hand, and take damage equal to its printed cost. Play that event ignoring the resource cost of that attack gains piercing. Now, again, this is the same exact thing as kind of Colossus, except Colossus says deal X amount of damage. He has to take it, which means if Wolverine has tough and tries to use this, and when he takes damage or it runs into his tough, well, he never actually took all the damage. Let's say you're playing a 3-cost event and you're supposed to take 3 damage. If it runs into a tough, you're no longer taking 3 damage, so thus you can't play this card. Deal and take is really tough to learn right now. It's really kind of weird. Hopefully you don't run into too many issues with it, but it all revolves around this cost arrow, and fully understand that cost arrow. I'm kind of shoving deal and take in there too, because again, it's in the rules, but it's not really explained very well, so I hate bringing it up. But that's like the really rough idea to understand with deal and take and the cost arrow. All right, we're halfway there with number 5, and we're going to talk about in play and out of play. In play, out of play, this is page 19 of the rules. So in play, a card is considered to either be in play or out of play depending on its state within the game. For player cards, the face-up side of a player's identity card is in play. The face-up ally cards, support cards, upgrade cards, and all that stuff are in play. In counter cards, the face-up side of the villain deck, the face-up side of basically any of the decks that you see, right? Anything that's face-up is in play. A card enters play when it moves from an out-of-play area to an in-play area. Card abilities only interact with and can only target cards that are in play, right? So if something's out of play, you can't interact with the out of play thing unless the ability text specifically refers to an out of play area, right? Card abilities on all card types except events, cards, and treachery cards can only be initiated or affect the game while being in play unless they specifically refer to being used out of play, right? So it goes a bunch of different things. Also, face down cards attached to in-play cards are out of play, right? That's also important to note. Why do we bring all this up? Well, this has to do with entering play. Let me see if I can find it really fast. So my number 6 thing that we're going to do is enters play. So the phrase enters play refers to any time a card transitions from an out of play area into play. Playing a card, putting a card into play by using a card ability or revealing a card from the encounter deck are all different means of which a card may enter play. And this is also revealing a card, right? If you were to reveal a card, let me do that really fast. I think we can find it. If you reveal the card, it's basically kind of the same exact thing, right? During step 4 of the villain phase, each player in player order reveals and resolves all face down encounter cards that have been dealt to them 1 card at a time. To reveal an encounter card, a player card flips it face up, resolves the card, right? It went from out of play to in play. So this is putting a card into play. Resolve, that's based on the different things, right? Attachment, enters play element, minion, all this fun stuff, right? All these different things, obligation, blah, blah. Okay. Also, with obligations given to the specified player, if no player specified, the player who dealt that card resolves it. Just fun fact to know. Okay, so why do we bring this up? Well, there's put into play, and put into play is a little bit different, and it's kind of annoyingly nuanced. But put into play, a card that resolves, and by placing this card into the player, this causes the card to enter play. Cards are played from a player's hand. Some ability cards to be put into play. This bypasses the need to pay the card's cost as well as any restrictions that prohibit it regarding playing that card. And this is important, right? Some abilities cause cards to be put into play. This bypasses the need to pay the card's cost as well as any restrictions or prohibits regarding playing that card. A card that is put into play enters play in its control player's area. So when an event card is played, all this fun stuff, a card is put in play that is considered played. Why do we go over this? Well, one of the things that comes up, especially early game when you're going through everything, is claw, right? So when you're playing claw, when you're getting set up, if you looked at, I think it's this card. So this is 1B. When it's revealed, discard cards from the encounter deck until a minion is discarded. Put that minion into play with the first player. Why is that important to note? Because if you did if one of the cards that you put into play was Weapons Runner, right? Normally, this card would surge, right? So it says surge after this card is revealed, reveal 1 additional encounter card. Well, you don't do that during setup, right? Because during setup, you're putting it into play, you're not revealing the card. Now, at any other time, generally speaking, it came from the encounter deck, you are revealing the card, and thus Weapons Runner would surge. This is one of the first really weird rule instances you'll probably deal with in your Marvel Champions journey. It can be a pain to deal with, but it's important to know the difference between putting in the play and put in the play. Or I should say, revealing and put in the play. See, even I mess it up sometimes, the wording exactly. But just understand revealing is different than put in the play. The one other thing I want to address with that too is that this bypasses the need to pay the card's cost as well any restrictions or prohibitions regarding playing that card. One example, and they don't have the image for it, is build support, right? So build support is one of the new player side schemes that's out there. Each player may search their deck and discard pile for a support with a cost of 3 or less and put it into play. So for example, if you did Queen Carrier, it states play only if your identity has the Avenger trait. You don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to check that anymore. So, for example, a Web Warrior, an X-Men, whomever can use build support to put Queen Carrier into play that normally wouldn't be allowed. And then you have a resource generator by using this card. Now, if the Queen Carrier gets knocked out for some reason, you can't really get back in unless you figure out a way to use build support again. But still, it's just an important note of understanding putting into play and revealing. All right, number 7 is indirect damage. This is one that came up a lot, especially during Sandman time. So this is page 20 of the rulebook. Some card abilities may deal indirect damage. Indirect damage dealt to a player can be defined as that player chooses among characters under their control. So you, your allies, whomever. Indirect damage dealt to a group of players or among players can be divided however they choose, right? While assigning indirect damage, a character cannot be assigned more indirect damage than would cause it to be defeated. This is assessed without accounting for interactions with other abilities. If an enemy's attack deals indirect damage, the indirect damage is dealt during step 4 of the enemy activation after players have the opportunity to defend against the attack. This is important to note too. So if you're getting 4 indirect damage and you have 2 defense, you can still exhaust the 2 to defend like you normally would, and you don't have to take all 4 indirect damage. You can defend against indirect damage. There's a lot of people that think you can't defend against indirect damage. You absolutely can. Only the defending character or the attack player's identity, if the attack was undefended, is considered to have been attacked, even if other characters were assigned some or all of the indirect damage. And that's important for other things. But one of the things that comes up a lot, and they actually have a 4 examples you should probably read too. If you take 5 indirect damage, but you control an ally with 4 hit points, you may assign 4 of that indirect damage to the ally, then assign the remaining 1 to your identity. A lot of people think that you can't knock out your ally with indirect damage. You absolutely can. They just can't absorb more than their life, right? So this example is absolutely perfect. It's a great way of learning this. But the 2 important things with indirect damage is you can defend against indirect damage. You are allowed to. And 2, you can have allies take the block and get knocked out. They just can't take more than their hit points. All right, next up we have interrupts and responses. This is interrupts on page 21. And this is just, in a general, a good thing to again, kind of learn. They've done some changes in the 1.5 rules. With interrupts, that players can only trigger interrupt abilities on cards they control or an encounter card. Players cannot trigger interrupt abilities on obligations in other people's play areas. Multiple interrupts can be triggered by the same triggering condition, but each interrupt can only be triggered once per occurrence of the triggering condition. Kind of weird wording, but basically, if something happens and you can play several interrupts, you're allowed to play several different interrupts, right? Important to know. So multiple interrupts can be triggered by the same triggering condition. But each interrupt can only be triggered once per occurrence of the triggering condition. So for some reason, if the triggering condition happened like several times and you played 1 interrupt, you only do it once still, right? But if one thing happens and you have like 4 interrupt cards that work and you want to play all 4, then you can play all 4 off of that 1 interrupt. Multiple copies of a card with an interrupt can each be triggered by the same triggering condition, kind of reiterating what I just said right there. And that's kind of the big one, because a lot of people thought that if something happens, you can only do 1 interrupt on it. It's not the case. You could do multiple. Interrupts that would use the word would resolve before its triggering condition initiates, when that condition becomes imminent, right? So again, would is an important word to note. So it happens before it. So it's just kind of really paying attention to the words and exactly what it says. Now, response is kind of like the opposite. I have to do the alphabet in my head because that's just how slow I am with things. All right, so response is a responsibility is a type of triggered ability indicated by the bold response. Okay. You can only trigger responsibilities on cards you control. Same exact thing, right? Same exact thing. Multiple responses may be executed from the same triggering condition, but each response may only be triggered once per occurrence, right? Same exact thing, same exact thing. So it's just kind of same exact thing, except happens after the fact, which is important to note. So a response opportunity occurs immediately after its triggering condition has been resolved. Opportunities to response occur in player order until all players have passed consecutively, which is another big one to note. Once the opportunity to respond to a triggering condition has been passed consecutively by all players, further responses that specific triggering condition cannot be used. So what does this mean? So Miss Marvel is a good example of kind of how this works, kind of. But there's a few different heroes that really work well with this. But anyway, a response opportunity occurs immediately after it's the triggering condition is resolved, right? So let's say something happens and you can play a response card, right? You can keep playing responses to the thing, right? Because the condition has happened and you're responding to the thing, right? Because as we said, excuse me, up here, players can only trigger response cards on abilities like where was it? Multiple responses may be executed from the same triggering condition, right? So you could do several different responses from that one condition. Like, don't think again, that's just one card and that's it. So this is just important to note with it. Opportunities to respond occur in player order until all players have passed consecutively. Again, it means like when you're like done responding to the thing, you kind of announce that you're done responding to the thing. Especially if you're playing multiplayer, it makes a little more sense. But yeah, it's just I think the important thing to note is that you can trigger the same card, or you can trigger cards off of one event, right? You can play several responses off of one trigger and condition. That's basically what this section and interrupt kind of says together. All right, so next up, I want to do page 38. This is villain defeat, and this is kind of a big section to learn because a lot of people have random questions with this. So we're gonna read through this because I think when people understand this, a lot of other random questions get solved, like a lot of them. So if a villain's hit point dial is reduced to 0, the players have defeated the stage of the villain. Remove the current stage of the villain deck from the game. The next sequential stage of the villain deck is revealed. Set that the hit points, right? If the final stage of the villain deck is defeated, you've won the game. Yay. Excess damage that is dealt to defeat a villain stage does not carry over, right? So nothing carries over. Attachments, upgrades, status cards, counters, and non-damage tokens on a villain carry over to the new stage, right? So this is huge. A lot of people ask this if they're playing a villain and they have, Drang's Spear or whatever, let's say on it, right? And they have a spear card and they knock out that villain. Does the villain keep their thing? No, they do not. Hey, future D20 here. Don't listen to the past D20. He was completely wrong. I literally just read the rules and I got it wrong. So anyway, to re-clarify this, so to make sure that you all understand, if the final stage of the villain deck is defeated, the players win the game. Excess damage that is dealt to defeat a villain stage does not carry over. Okay, the important thing I messed up here. Attachments, upgrades, status cards, counters, and non-damage tokens on the villain carry over to a new stage. And then I used the Drang example, and I was like, oh, if he has Drang's Spear and you knock out him, like it doesn't carry over. It does. I don't know how I got that wrong. I guess I was reading the next sentence and I messed up in my head. I don't know. Anyway, let me reiterate this so that people don't call me out on it. Attachments, upgrades, status cards, counters, and non-damage tokens on a villain carry over to the new stage. Sorry for that mistake. The only exception is if the villain has a different title, which I'll talk about in a second if I didn't just talk about it already. Sorry for the mistake. Okay, enjoy the video. The one weirdest exception is if the new stage of the villain has a different title from the previous stage. Attachments, upgrades, status cards, counters, non-damage tokens do not carry over. So for example, in the most recent expansion that we've had in Marvel Champions and Next Evolution, you play through the Marauders deck, right? When you do Morlock Siege, right? So Morlock Siege, I think is what it is. Shuffle the villains together without looking to create a villain deck. The top card is considered to be in play. And then you can go through all these different Marauders, right? Blockbuster and whatever, and all these different people. So basically, a Blockbuster, let's say, right? Let's say you start with Blockbuster here, has an attachment. You knock him out, and then Chimera is next. Chimera doesn't get the attachment, right? Chimera doesn't get the upgrade or whatever it is. It got knocked out with Blockbuster, right? So that's important to know. If a villain is defeated while activating, the villain resumes that activation using a new villain stage. If the new stage of the villain has a different title than the previous stage, the activation ends without resolving, right? So if somehow you knock them out in the middle of their activation, they still activate, right? It doesn't cancel the whole thing out. So these are all important to note. One of the other things I'll note that isn't in this section, but it's important to note, is that retaliate, right? People ask us a lot about retaliate. If stage 1 of a villain has retaliate and you do damage and it goes into stage 2, they still have retaliate, and they still have retaliate, either printed on the card or an attachment that gives them retaliate. You still get retaliated, right? You don't not get retaliated. It carries over. This was more of a Hall of Heroes ruling that kind of keeps up the things and does a bunch of things. But anyway, that still happens, right? That's a rule I get wrong all the time, so don't feel bad if you get it wrong too. That's one that always throws me off. Even if you defeat the villain, I understand that, like, especially if it says, like, on its text box, like Zola says retaliate on it. You go to stage 2 Zola, you still get retaliated. All right, this last one was one that I was kind of hesitant to put in, but I feel like you kind of have to. It is the biggest rules question that's out there in Marvel Champions. It's one of the most confusing topics that's out there, and that's the word you. You is very, very confusing. It's very, very tough. And basically, the joke that we make a lot of times is you refers to you unless it doesn't. Yeah, exactly. So this is page 40 and continues through page 41. I mean, this is how much you there is, right? This entire right-hand column and goes into this left column. It's very, very convoluted. It's kind of been the same for a while, but a little bit changed. But anyway, there is a chance that there's a lot of nuance with the word you. There's a lot of nuance with the word you. So it's still a mistake I make a lot. It's one I hate bringing up because I'm always worried I'm going to make another mistake with it. So if there's a situation that arises with you and it doesn't work with the way I'm talking about, please just put it down in the comments. We're all just trying to help each other out here. But very generally, you is you the hero. You is your events, more or less. Not more or less, it's your events. And you is your upgrades. But you is not your allies and you is not your support. Mostly. And actually, almost all the time, it just depends on how you think about things. So if a card deals damage to you or you take damage, the player resolving that damage applies the hit point to their identity, right? That shows that it's to you, not to your allies. A lot of people ask this. And actually, we'll get this out of the way right now. A lot of people ask this, that if, let's say a villain attacks your character. All right, let's say you're Spider-Man and you're going against Rhino, right? And Rhino attacks you, as in Spider-Man. And you have Black Cat step in and block it instead. Did Rhino attack Spider-Man or did Rhino attack Black Cat? Right? This is the question. And your gut might say, well, Rhino attacked Black Cat. And not really. Rhino actually still attacked Spider-Man. Black Cat just blocked it. This seems like a really stupid thing and it shouldn't like matter, but it is kind of important with how certain things work. You are still being attacked, right? Rhino never changed who he was attacking. You changed who was defending, right? So again, we'll get into this a little bit why this kind of matters. But if you are Spider-Man and you are being attacked, you are still the attackee, not Black Cat who stepped in the way. So again, we'll get into this in a second. If a card ability deals indirect damage to you, or you take indirect damage, the player resolving that damage can assign the damage to characters in play under their control. And we talked about this with indirect before. If a card ability exhausts you, the player resolving that card ability exhausts their identity, right? So again, if it's saying you have to exhaust whatever, you as the hero have to do it, and you can't do it to like an ally or something. If a card ability places a status card on you, you put it on your identity, blah, blah. Okay, so actually, let's do this. If the card ability triggers from a game function that you perform, such as after you attack and defeat an enemy, the player resolving that ability must resolve the card ability as if their identity they control performed that game function if able. For example, if an ability triggers after you attack and defeat a minion, it triggers after the controlling player's identity attacks and defeats a minion, but not when an ally under that player's control attacks and defeats a minion. This is really huge to learn and understand, right? It is not when, if you have a card out there that, again, says this, if a minion says after you attack and defeat that minion or whatever, right? If your ally does it, you didn't do it. Your ally did it. Here's the other exception too. For abilities that trigger after enemy attacks you, You refers to the attacked player, even if that player defended with an ally. Why does this matter? We're going to take Dr. Octopus, for example. After Dr. Octopus makes an attack and damages you, place one threat in the main scheme, move it. Right? And this is all the Sinister Six. It says, like, after so-and-so attacks and damages you, place one threat. Okay, so if Doc Ock is attacking Spider-Man and I block with Black Cat, he has still attacked me, but he hasn't damaged me. Unless there is a way that he ends up damaging me, then you would still activate this card. But he has not attacked Black Cat, right? So it's kind of weird and it's kind of confusing and it's really, really, again, nuanced with it. But if you understand this phrase right here and the exception, you'll probably be pretty good with understanding you generally. But just really understand this section of you. And then it talks about resolving card abilities, but you cannot be resolved as referring to a player's identity. It must be resolved as referring to the player. This kind of gets into you. The first section is more or less you as a player's identity, and this refers to you as a player, right? So there is a way they use you several different ways, which does get confusing. So this goes into the cards that are extension of a player's identity, which are events or resources with the other one. Upgrades, players that are not considered a part of it, or allies and support. So this is the whole U section. As you tell, it's one of the longer sections. And again, you control, this talks about the card and all this fun stuff. Some player cards so yeah, this just kind of goes into all this and whatnot. I wish I could give more good examples of you and how it kind of affects things, but it's one of those weird, random things that just like kind of shows up. So if you struggle with you, don't feel bad. Like, a lot of people struggle with how you works. It can be confusing. Is it referring to my hero? Is it referring to me as a person? And the answer is depends, right? Depends. It's generally not your ally. But the other important thing to just note about that is, again, for abilities that trigger after enemy attacks you, you refers to the attack player, even if that player defended with an ally. That's huge, right? That's really, really huge to know and to learn. All right, hopefully this video was somewhat useful to you. I'm not perfect with rules. Don't think just because I went through this and I read this stuff that I'm perfect with rules. If you watch my live streams over on twitch.tv/D20 Woodworking, I get a lot wrong. All right, I have to like clarify with chat, or I have to pull up the rule book and read through it and read through different sections. Like, it's tough. So play the way the best that you can. You're gonna make mistakes. It happens. It's totally cool. Don't worry about it. Very few people play an absolutely perfect game. It's just what happens. So don't feel bad. Or if you've been playing wrong this whole time, it's all right. I've played games wrong for the whole time for a long while, right? I've made that mistake too. So if you have any more rules questions, put it down below. I would love to try to help out and and answer them for you. If it's easier, join our Discord. The link's down below. Check that out. To if you have rules questions, you could ask them in there, and we'll have some people that are more than happy to help you out. And then finally, if this video was helpful to you, if you learned anything, if it was useful, whatever, hit the like button and hit subscribe. That stuff really helps the channel. It really helps me out, and I really appreciate it. And I will see you all next time.